The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon. Chapter 1. One summer afternoon, Mrs. Oedipa Maas came home from a Tupperware party whose hostess had put perhaps too much kirsch in the fondue to find that she, Oedipa, had been named executor, or, she supposed, executrix, of the estate of one Pierce in Verity, a California real estate mogul who had once lost $2 million in his spare time, but still had assets numerous and tangled enough to make the job of sorting it all out more than honorary. Oedipa stood in the living room, stared at by the greenish dead eye of the TV tube, spoke the name of God, tried to feel as drunk as possible. But this did not work. She thought of a hotel room in Mazatlán, whose door had just been slammed. It seemed forever, waking up 200 birds down in the lobby, a sunrise over the library slope at Cornell University that nobody out on it had seen because the slope faces west, a dry, disconsolate tune from the fourth movement of the Bartók Concerto for Orchestra, a whitewashed bust of Jay Gould that Pierce had kept over the bed on a shelf so narrow for it she'd always had the hovering fear it would someday topple on them. Was that how he died, she wondered, among dreams, crushed by the only icon in the house? That only made her laugh, out loud and helpless. "You're so sick, Oedipa," she told herself, or the room, which knew. The letter was from the law firm of Warp, Wistful, Kubitschek, and McMingus of Los Angeles, and was signed by somebody named Metzger. It said Pierce had died back in the spring, and they'd only just now found the will. Metzger was about to act as co-executor and special counsel in the event of any involved litigation. Oedipa had been named also to execute the will in a codicil dated a year ago. She tried to think back to whether anything unusual had happened around then. Through the rest of the afternoon, through her trip to the market in downtown Kinneret among the pines to buy ricotta and listen to the Muzak, today she came through the beaded curtain entrance around Bar 4 of the Fort Wayne Cinesetto Ensemble's Verorium recording of the Vivaldi Kazoo Concerto, Boyd Beaver soloist. Then through the sunned gathering of her marjoram and sweet basil from the herb garden, reading of book reviews in the latest Scientific American, into the layering of a lasagna, garlicking of the bread, tearing up of the romaine leaves, eventually oven on into the mixing of the Twilight's whiskey sours against the arrival of her husband, Wendell Mucho Mas, from work. She wondered, shuffling back through a fat deck full of days which seemed, wouldn't she be the first to admit it, more or less identical, or all pointing the same way subtly like a conjurer's deck, any odd one readily clear to a trained eye. It took her till the middle of Huntley and Brinkley to remember that last year at 3 or so one morning there had come this long-distance call, from where she would never know, unless now he'd left a diary, by a voice beginning in heavy Slavic tones as the second secretary at the Transylvanian consulate looking for an escaped bat, modulated to comic Negro, and then into hostile Pachuco accent full of chingas and maricons, then a Gestapo officer asking her in shrieks did she have relatives in Germany, and finally in his Lamont Cranston voice, the one he talked in all the way down to Mazatlán, "Pierce, please," she'd managed to get in. "I thought we had—" But Margot, earnestly, "I've just come from Commissioner Weston, and that old man in the fun house was murdered by the same blowgun that killed Professor Quackenbush, or something." "For God's sake," she said. Mucho had rolled over and was looking at her. "Why don't you hang up on him?" Mucho suggested sensibly. "I heard that," Pierce said. "I think it's time Wendell Moss and I had a little visit from the shadow." Silence, positive and thorough, fell. So it was the last of his voices she ever heard. Lamont Cranston. That phone line could have been pointed in any direction, been any length. Its quiet ambiguity shifted over, in the months after the call, to what had been revived, memories of his face, body, things he'd given her, things she had now, and then pretended to have heard him say. It took him over, and to the verge of being forgotten. The shadow waited a year before visiting. But now there was Metzger's letter. Had Pierce called last year then to tell her about this codicil? Or had he decided on it later on, somehow because of her annoyance and Mucho's indifference? She felt exposed, finessed, put down. She never had executed a will in her life and didn't know where to begin, didn't know how to tell the law firm in L.A. that she didn't know where to begin. "Mucho, baby," she cried in an access of helplessness. "Mucho mas," home, bounded through the screen door. "Today was another defeat," he began. "Let me tell you," she also began, but let Mucho go first. He was a disc jockey who worked further along the peninsula and suffered regular crises of conscience about his profession. "I don't believe in any of it, Ed," he could usually get out. "I try. I truly can't." Way down there, further down perhaps than she could reach, so that such times often brought her near panic. It might have been the sight of her, so about to lose control, that seemed to bring him back up. "You're too sensitive." Yeah, there was so much else she ought to be saying also, but that's what came out. It was true anyway. For a couple of years, he'd been a used car salesman and so hyper-aware of what that profession had come to mean that working hours were exquisite torture to him. Mucho shaved his upper lip every morning 3 times, with 3 times against the grain to remove any remotest breath of a mustache. New blades, he drew blood invariably, but kept at it. Bought all-natural shoulder suits, then went to a tailor to have the lapels made yet more abnormally narrow. On his hair, used only water, combing it like Jack Lemmon to throw them further off. The sight of sawdust, even pencil shavings, made him wince, his own kind being known to use it for hushing sick transmissions. And though he dieted, he still could not, as Oedipa did, use honey to sweeten his coffee, for like all things viscous, it distressed him, recalling too poignantly what is often mixed with motor oil to ooze dishonest into gaps between piston and cylinder wall. He walked out of a party one night because someone used the word cream puff. It seemed maliciously in his hearing. The man was a refugee Hungarian pastry cook talking shop, but there was your Mucho, thin-skinned. Yet at least he believed in the cars, maybe to excess. How could he not, seeing people poorer than him come in, Negro, Mexican, cracker, a parade 7 days a week, bringing the most god-awful of trade-ins, motorized metal extensions of themselves, of their families, and what their whole lives must be like, out there so naked for anybody, a stranger like himself, to look at, frame cockeyed, rusty underneath, fender repainted in a shade just off enough to depress the value. If not Mucho himself, inside smelling hopelessly of children, supermarket booze, 2, sometimes 3 generations of cigarette smokers, or only of dust. And when the cars were swept out, you had to look at the actual residue of these lives. And there was no way of telling what things had been truly refused, when so little, he supposed, came by that out of fear most of it had come to be taken and kept. And what had simply, perhaps tragically, been lost, clipped coupons promising savings of 5 or 10 cents, trading stamps, pink flyers advertising specials at the markets, butts, tooth-shy combs, help-wanted ads, yellow pages torn from the phone book, rags of old underwear or dresses that already were period costumes for wiping your own breath off the inside of a windshield so you could see whatever it was, a movie, a woman, or a car you coveted, a cop who might pull you over just for drill. All the bits and pieces coated uniformly like a salad of despair in a gray dressing of ash, condensed, exhaust, dust, body wastes. It made him sick to look, but he had to look. If it had been an outright junkyard, probably he could have stuck things out, made a career. The violence that caused each wreck being infrequent enough, far away from him to be miraculous, as each death up till the moment of our own is miraculous. But the endless rituals of trade in week after week never got as far as violence or blood, and so were too plausible for the impressionable Mucho to take for long. Even if enough exposure to the unvarying gray sickness had somehow managed to immunize him, he could still never accept the way each owner, each shadow, filed in only to exchange a dented, malfunctioning version of himself for another, just as a futureless automotive projection of somebody else's life, as if it were the most natural thing. To Mucho it was horrible, endless, convoluted incest.